Our program will begin momentarily.
Allowing people to get settled a little bit. And we will have others who will join us, come in and join us as we proceed. All right. Thank you and good afternoon. Greetings to everyone. I am Brian Arkwright. I am the President and CEO of City First Bank of DC, and most importantly for this event, the Chairman of City First Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to City First's 25th anniversary Impact Forum and awards reception, which will follow, and this portion, which is really the future of urban resilience. Today is Friday, December 7th. We're doing that for streaming because you know we're here at Halcyon, and streaming live on our Facebook page, which is City First. We are very proud to present our 5th Community Development Finance Conference. And this year it's part of a 4-part series, which we've been calling Impact Forums, plus our 25th anniversary event as part of our forum finale. We've been partnering with key impact and community development experts who have been paving the way and innovating in the respective fields across public, private, nonprofit, and philanthropic sectors. In each case, sharing candid insight and firsthand knowledge about what's now and, more importantly, what's next. This year alone, we've had 4 forums inclusive in 2018. We started off in May with the Nonprofit Leadership Awards, and we also combined that with a series, New Market Tax Credits as a tool, and that was back in May. Then we had the Future of Impact Investing is Local, which we had over at the Washington, D.C. Economic Partnership. That was in September. We followed that in October with the future of affordable housing development at the Anacostia Arts Center, and today, the future of urban resilience here at Halcyon. All of these critical conversations, the purpose is really to grow the impact of our collective work and expand our opportunities, all of our opportunities, collectively in serving low to moderate income communities. So as you saw in the opening screen or video, since 1999, City First Bank, City First Enterprises, and City First Homes have been targeting their lending and investment to the preservation of and creation of affordable housing, that being one of our verticals here in the district, but also in the surrounding communities of Maryland, Virginia, and Baltimore. A couple years ago, we established 3 pillars for our work and our focus: impact, leadership, and culture, and we really use those internally to focus our work, but I'd like to share a little bit of what that means for the first time with you externally. When we talk about impact, we're really talking about impact of a resilient nature for underserved folks. So we're really focusing on how do we create impact through both capital, but also through programming and leadership. Leadership that evokes solutions and action in support of the underserved communities. So again, we expect and hope to show both thought leadership and actual leadership in that field. And then culture that really drives inclusion, focus, respect, and results. These are our 3 rally cries, if you will. So just a little bit about our host today, which is the City First Foundation. Its mission is to promote broader knowledge, participation, and collaboration in the community development ecosystem, particularly here in Washington, D.C. And the obvious reason we want that collaboration, again, is to drive change through idea sharing. As I said today, you'll hear from public, private, and nonprofit sector leaders who are going to discuss how we can collectively accelerate DC's resiliency, a term that we're going to learn about and begin to use more as a holistic term for our city and our communities. So the future of urban resilience. Let me do a couple of housekeeping items so that we all have a good day while we're here. First of all, you all have programs, and in your programs you will find bios for many of the speakers. You also can go to cityfirstfoundation.com, cityfirstfoundation.com, that's our website, and there'll be more additional bios of additional speakers and some content that I think you'll find very interesting as you continue to explore what your impact can be in this area. As I mentioned at the top of the presentation, we're streaming live from our Facebook page. We love social media, and as you are engaged here or otherwise, use the hashtag, use the handle, I guess you call it, I don't know, hashtag CityFirst25. What do you call that? Is that the handle? Use the, Hashtag, okay. Use the hashtag CityFirst25. The flow of the day, we're going to have, in just a moment, a data presentation from the Urban Institute and Peter, who's sitting right here. We're going to go into our panel discussion, hopefully a little bit of Q&A, and then we'll go into our awards reception at around 6. And then after that, the staff will have their holiday party because this is the season, so we'll move to that. The restrooms also are here to the left through that door, and the Wi-Fi is up on the screen if you need to use that. I'd really like to particularly thank our sponsors and supporters who help us to be able to bring this to you. If you look at the back of your program, you will see them, many of them listed, but I want to highlight a few who have been particularly generous with their support and time. The Bernstein Companies, Holland & Knight, JP Morgan Chase, Promontory Interfinancial, Bank of America, CohnReznick, SunTrust Bank, the CDC at US Bancorp, Wells Fargo, FIS, and DC's Housing Finance Agency. So thank you all. And again, to everyone here in the room and out on electronic media, we welcome you and we thank you for being here. All right, let's get started. And to do so, let me just set a little bit of the stage, and Peter, you can really lay the full table out for everyone. In an equitable DC, every resident would have the opportunity to prosper. but decades, or let me correct myself, really centuries of discriminatory and non-supportive housing policies and practices, not just housing, have created inequities by ward, by neighborhood, by race, and by ethnicity. The efforts in the public, private, and non-profit sector, meaning the interventions, have narrowed these gaps, or at least attempted to narrow these gaps, but there's much more that needs to be done to level the playing field. So I'd like you to welcome Peter Tatian, who's a senior fellow and the research director at the Urban Institute, who's going to share a new tool and some data to help us understand this gap. Thank you, Peter.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you to City First for inviting me here today. It's my pleasure to share with you this new tool that we've created as part of our Urban Greater DC initiative. Urban Greater DC is the Urban Institute's initiative to contribute to the positive development and more equitable development of the region where we all live and work. So Urban is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year and next year, and so we're very excited to be launching this new initiative as part of that as well. I'm going to share this new tool. There we go. And the origin of this tool was a feature that we had done back in 2016 called A Vision for an Equitable DC. And that feature looked at racial equity, specifically for DC's African American and Latino populations. And in that feature, we had some graphics like this, which looked at key indicators, in this case poverty status, and compared the poverty statuses for whites, African Americans, and Latinos. And so the blue dots on this chart represent numbers of people who are above the poverty threshold, and the red dots represent how many more African Americans and how many more Latinos would need to be above poverty to match the white poverty rate. So, the tool also discussed, as Brian mentioned, the centuries of racial discrimination and practices that helped create many of these gaps. So people really seem to appreciate and respond well to this presentation, so we thought we might do something more interactive version of these same types of measures. So that leads me to the new tool that we just unveiled this past month. Here's the web address where you can get to that tool, and we hope that you all will take the opportunity to explore it after this presentation. I want to acknowledge the support of JP Morgan Chase, who provided some grant funding to help us create this tool. And this tool has a geographic lens rather than a race or ethnic lens. But we do provide some demographic information on the places in the tool so that you can see what the racial and ethnic composition of the places that you're comparing. Okay, so let me introduce how the tool works. So when you go to the tool, you will see these three selections that you need to make. The first one is you need to pick an indicator. So we have in the tool 16 indicators that we've provided data for, covering a range of topics that you can see here: economics, workforce, housing, health, public safety, community amenities. And these are all things that you can explore through this tool. So I'm going to start with post-secondary education, which is the number of adults who have either a 2- or 4-year college degree. So that's I'll start with that one, and we'll get into some other indicators as I go through the presentation. The next thing I need to do is select a place that I'm interested in. So in the tool, you can select from among DC's 8 wards, as well as all the neighborhood clusters in the city. So neighborhood clusters are groups of 3 to 5 neighborhoods that were developed and are used by the DC Office of Planning. So you can either pick a place from the maps like you see here, or from a list of places. I'm going to pick for this presentation, the Deanwood, Burville, Grant Park, Lincoln Heights, and Fairmont Heights neighborhood cluster, which is highlighted in yellow here, which, to save time, I'm going to just refer to as the Deanwood cluster from now on. So once I pick that area, I'm presented with this default display. So it compares, for the post-secondary education indicator I picked, Deanwood versus DC overall as the default comparison. And so we can see that in Deanwood, 19% of adults have a post-secondary degree, as shown in the top bar. But for DC overall, it's 58% of adults. So if we wanted to close the equity gap based on the DC average, about 3,335 more adults in Deanwood would need to have post-secondary degrees. So this not only tells you that there is a gap, but it quantifies the size of the gap, and that can help inform actions that we need to take to close those gaps. I can also change the comparison. So DC is the default comparison, but let's say I want to compare Deanwood cluster to Ward 2. In Ward 2, there's a higher percentage of adults who have post-secondary degrees, 85%. And so if we wanted to close this equity gap, we'd need about 5,600 more adults in Deanwood to have a post-secondary degree. Or maybe let's look at where we are today, the Georgetown, Burleith, Hillendale neighborhood cluster, where 92% of adults who live here have post-secondary degrees. And so to close that gap, we'd need 6,200 more Deanwood residents to have a post-secondary education. So our hope here is that people will do this kind of what-if comparisons so that they can set targets for where they want their communities to be. So by giving them access to this tool, we hope that they can have those kinds of thoughts and conversations about equity. Okay. In addition to the data, we also provide some information, context, for each of the indicators. So first of all, we explain why is this indicator important? Why do we think this is an important measure? In the case of post-secondary education, it's because a lot of jobs now, particularly higher paying jobs with good benefits, require a post-secondary education of some kind. And so we provide that in context, and we also provide links to research and other resources that back up those points. In addition, because we want the tool to be used to inform action, we have some thoughts about what kinds of things we could do to change the situation and close these gaps. So in this example, for instance, we cite perhaps more funding for public universities and colleges, more support for student services, and again, we provide links to resources that talk about these kinds of actions. So every indicator in the tool has this kind of information. Now, to be clear, we are by no means saying that this is the answer to this problem and this is the exhaustive list of all solutions. We understand these are very complicated issues, and so there's a lot more solutions we need to talk about and things that people are doing now, as well as things that we need to do in the future. But we want to help start those conversations, so we want to provide that information. So let me go through a few more indicators and return to my comparison. So this measure is a health-related measure. The number of mothers who gave birth in a year with having received adequate prenatal care, and that's based on the number of visits they made to a healthcare provider, as well as when those visits started during their pregnancy. DC actually has a very high rate of health insurance coverage, but unfortunately that doesn't always lead to better health service use or better health outcomes. So as you can see here, 44% of mothers living in Deanwood who gave birth in 2016 had received adequate prenatal care, compared to 82% in the Georgetown cluster. And so to close that gap, we would need another 96 mothers in Deanwood to receive adequate prenatal care. We also have data on premature deaths. This is an age-adjusted rate of people who died before the age of 75 years old. In the Georgetown cluster, only 1 person out of 1,000 deaths was premature, but it was 9 out of 1,000 in Deanwood. So to close this gap, we'd need 92 fewer people in the Deanwood cluster dying before the age of 75. Of course, diet is one thing that's very important regarding health. We have a measure of how many people live within 1 mile of a major grocery store. And as you can see, 100% of the people who live in Deanwood cluster are within that distance of a major grocery store, compared to 21% of those who live in the Deanwood cluster. So to get equity on this measure, we need to provide 10,000 more people in the Deanwood cluster access to a major grocery store. Among the economic measures, we have the number of full-time workers making over $35,000 a year, which roughly corresponds to DC's living wage. So another 1,320 or so full-time workers living in Deanwood would need to earn that much to achieve equity with workers who are living in the Georgetown cluster. And lower wages translate into more people in poverty, so we'd need 1,700 more people above the poverty threshold in Deanwood cluster to have equity with the Georgetown cluster. And for children, almost 1,200 more children would need to be elevated above poverty to get to 99% above poverty, which is the rate for children living in the Georgetown cluster. On housing, we would need 626 more households in Deanwood to own their homes to get to a 56% homeownership rate that is equivalent to the Georgetown cluster. And then finally, we have a measure that looks at homes sold that are affordable to the average household of color in DC, which for the time we're looking at is about $68,000 a year is the income of the average household of color in DC. And this measure is sort of looking at the adequacy of access to opportunities to live in different neighborhoods and wards in the city. So in this case, as you can see, the Deanwood cluster has more homes sold that are affordable to buyers at this income, about a third of the homes sold in 2017. But only 2 homes sold in Georgetown in that year, or 1%, were affordable to the average household of color. So we can flip the comparison, and in this case, for this measure, Georgetown would need 73 more homes sold in 2017 that were affordable to the average household of color to close the equity gap with the Deanwood cluster. All right, so I hope that was a good introduction to the tool and again stimulated your interest to take a look at it yourself. And so again, our hope is that this tool will give community members information they can use when having conversations with decision makers, investors, service providers, and others as to what their vision is of what equity means for their community. So we also hope this tool will sponsor more or spur more conversations about equity in DC, and like the one that our panel is about to have, and that it will also include discussing the structural barriers and racist barriers that have created and perpetuated many of these inequities and how we can best address those challenges as well. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to today's discussion.
Okay. Hi, everyone. How are you? Good. My name's Kate Goodall. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Halcyon, and we all thought it might be a little bit helpful for those of you, and there are not many, this is a pretty friendly crowd, I know most of you, but for those of you who don't know much about what we do here, to give you a little bit of a grounding and a little bit of a lead into the next panel. So Halcyon provides space, community, and access to the best social entrepreneurs from around the world. We have another building where we also do that for artists that are working on social change and social justice. That's just up the road north of Duke Ellington. But in this place, we provide residency for those social entrepreneurs, so they actually get to come and live with us for 5 months. They get a stipend, they get legal help, business help from Deloitte, and we do not take any equity. We've become pretty selective. We take 8 ventures twice a year from a pool of about 500 from around the world, although half of those are from this area. And over 4.5 years, we have collectively, those ventures have impacted over 700,000 lives around the world. They've created nearly 600 jobs, half of those in the district. And they've raised over $56 million in support of their ventures. So take that, Amazon. It's all hockey sticking as well. Most importantly, 52% of our ventures have a founder or co-founder who is a woman, and 59% have a founder of color. We like to say that we really see who starts companies before systemic challenges get in the way and make them not look like the people who are in Fortune 500 company boardrooms. And we are dedicated to changing the latter. When we first started, we faced a lot of skepticism around social enterprise. For those of you who may not have an innate grasp of what a social enterprise is, the way that we define that is an entrepreneur who is tackling and measuring their impact towards a problem or challenge in social or environmental fields. But we are very serious about profit as well, and I think we got a lot of investors initially who really misunderstood what is meant by social enterprise. We were not advocating at any point for our companies to give away investors' profits. So we really do focus on finding the most talented people with the best ideas for tackling these social environmental problems and help them grow great, highly profitable businesses because only then can you have a real, sustainable and scalable impact. We would also argue that social enterprises really have the business edge. They attract better, more dedicated employees. They align with future consumer trends by any measure that you care to look at. And we think that they could possibly take even better advantage in the future of opportunities in selling to business and government. We just maybe need to look at how we do procurement, but I'll let Sonal touch on all of that. We are now seeing that we're on the right side of history. We're feeling very confident about that. And as people really do continue to question how we measure the health of a city or country beyond GDP, and start to prioritize health, happiness, and sustainability more and more frequently in an equal measure to profit or growth, then I think we can all agree that this is one of the ways that we're going to get there. We are indeed at a consumer and investor inflection point. The 2017 move by Vanguard and BlackRock that forced Exxon to start to measure its impact towards climate change is perhaps the most famous case, but we believe, again, that's just one of many that we're starting to see. And what if DC could be on the leading edge of all of that? What if we could be in the vanguard of cities that are really measuring in a very intrinsic way and reporting towards everything beyond economic measures in equal proportion? One of the ways to accomplish this is certainly increased collaboration between sectors. There are so many people in this room that I know that really understand that, and we're all doing a fantastic job, I think, already of trying to help each other, as we all know that's the fastest way forward. But I do think we can even increase that cross-sectoral collaboration. And I just want to say a quick thank you before the panel to City First for leading the way in that vein and on that front, as they continue to do. So thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoy the next panel, and I'll talk to you all hopefully at a break.
Thank you, Kate and Peter, for both laying the foundation of the gap, specifically here in DC, and then talking about some of the innovative solutions, particularly your stats around women entrepreneurship and minority or people of color entrepreneurship, because we're talking about issues here that really ultimately go to wealth and access. And so thank you all both for that. We're going to have our next panel begin to assemble up here at the stage. So Bo, if you will be so kind as to bring your panel up. And as they do come up, I'll give you a little bit of background. So the panel is called Strengthening the City Towards Resiliency. There's that word again, resiliency. I hope somebody's going to tell me what that means. So persistent social, economic, and environmental equality, just as we have been discussing, and increasingly unaffordable housing are some of the issues putting even the most prosperous cities such as ours and its people under chronic stress. I think that's going to be a key, chronic. Our cities are also under threat to experience more acute shocks, such as flooding, infrastructure issues, and infrastructure failures. So to prepare, the public and private sector will need to develop holistic solutions that enable our cities to thrive in the face of change. So Bo, thank you for leading this panel. I should mention, again, all the bios are in both in your package, but also on our website, cityfirstfoundation.org. But for Bo, I have to say he's the CEO of the McKinney Group, but also he's the newly elected vice chair of City First Bank. So we're proud to have him. Thank you, Bo.
Great. So thanks, Brian. It's really my honor to get to hopefully moderate a conversation of this amazing panel and a conversation around how we strengthen the city towards resiliency as we move forward. So we've got an amazing panel and some really interesting perspectives to share. So I'm just going to do some really quick intros. All this information is in your brochures, and I know I'm not going to do justice to the amazing accomplishments of these folks. But we have Sarah Rosen-Wartell, the president of the Urban Institute. In 2012, she became the third president of the Urban Institute since it was founded in 1968. Urban is an economic and social science research and policy organization with more than 450 researchers, experts, and other staff that believe in the power of evidence to improve lives and strengthen communities. And during her tenure there, she's articulated a strategy to elevate the debate by bringing more of its insights from research to federal, state, and local governments and helping them put them into practice. At the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development from 1993 to 1998, she advised the Federal Housing Commission on housing finance and mortgage markets, consumer protection. So she's an expert in community development, consumer finance, asset building, and housing finance, and we're excited to have her with us today. We've got George Jones, the CEO of Bread for the City. George has been CEO of Bread for the City for over 20 years and has led Bread for the City's growth from a $1.2 million operation in 1996 to a $10.6 million operation in 2014, and really grown the impact of that organization throughout the city. The mission of Bread for the City is to help Washington, D.C. residents living with low incomes to develop their power to determine the future on their own and the future of their own communities. Mr. Jones also serves on the board of the D.C. Primary Care Association, a nonprofit that advocates for the expansion of healthcare access and reduction of healthcare disparities among low-income D.C. residents. And he's also on the board of the Center for Nonprofit Advancement and the Capital Area Food Bank. And in 2015, Georgetown University recognized him with the John Thompson Jr. Legacy of a Dream Award as one of the city's leaders addressing some of the most pressing challenges that our city faces. So we've got Dr. Janae Queen Nazir, the Managing Director of Performance and Results for Living Cities. And as the Managing Director of Performance and Results at Living Cities, Dr. Queen has been contributing to the strategic vision of Living Cities in its quest for racial income, to close racial income and wealth gaps. She helps support the internal work of Living Cities as it deals with racial equity, and I think has a really interesting perspective on how organizations think about racial equity inside their organization. She views equity challenges in cities as exciting opportunities to re-examine the impact we can create for the country's most marginalized communities. And you'll start to see there's some really interesting different perspectives here. We have Kevin Bush. He is DC's Chief Resiliency Officer, so he's going to give us some perspective on what is resiliency and how does it actually impact, how do we think about that and what we're doing. In 2016, DC was selected from over 1,000 cities around the world to become part of the 100 Resilient Cities Network. So in his work, he sort of thinks about how DC responds to sudden shocks and chronic stresses and oversees the development and implementation of a comprehensive resiliency strategy. He views the only way to do this is with the whole community, working across the silos of government and the different sectors to holistically plan for the future of DC. And really pay particular attention to how we meet the needs of our vulnerable populations. And then finally, we've got Sonal Shah, the Executive Director of the Beck Center for Social Impact at Georgetown University. She's been a member of the Georgetown faculty since 2014. Under the Obama administration, she served as Deputy Assistant to the President for President Obama and founded the White House Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation. Sonal led the efforts to set up innovative finance mechanisms for service delivery, leveraging technology to better engage citizens in government, and creating new public-private partnerships that supported and trained leaders throughout government to institutionalize innovative practices. So we've got some data perspectives, data and research. We've got equity inside organizations. We've got resiliency as a city and her resiliency. We've got the federal perspective and the global perspective and the university perspective. And we've got on the ground working with constituents on a day-to-day basis perspective. So we're excited to kick off this conversation. So maybe just to kick it off, Kevin, if you want to tell us a little bit like, what is resiliency? What is resiliency and how does it relate? Like, how does it connect to community development?
Thanks, Bo, and I applaud you all for coming here and for City First for organizing a panel on resilience and then asking me what it was after the panel started. So this is great.
I figure people should know what they're here to talk about.
It's fair enough, fair enough. So my wife used to make fun of me for going to family events, parties, etc., and not being able to succinctly describe what it is that I do. So I've honed it now, and resilience is the immune system of the city. I think that cities are undergoing an impressive amount of change, whether that's climate change or growth. People are moving to cities at an unprecedented rate around the world. And these same challenges are challenges that cities around the world share. We've hosted recently the mayor of The Hague and the mayor of Porto Alegre here in DC, which also have chief resilience officers. And we have the exact same issues. And we need to think about how our investments in any one of our 60-plus odd agencies that we have in the District of Columbia work together with the work that our institutions, like our universities, are making to make sure that we're doing everything we can to plan for the future. And in DC, I think that means being resilient to climate change. It means being resilient to population and economic growth, and also being resilient to technological change.
So how do you think, how is resiliency relevant to community development?
Well, so I think it's a great question and one that I'm used to hearing. So before taking this job, I worked for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development on climate change and disaster recovery. And I think when you start to think through different scenarios, it's not that hard to see how they relate. So for instance, when I was at HUD, there were 2 unnamed rainstorms that hit the state of Louisiana. And they hit the state at a time when the housing vacancy rate was next to nil. People were doubled up, they were tripled up. They were living in unstable housing situations before the rainstorms. Then all of a sudden these big storms come in and they knock out what's left of the housing supply. You basically have a negative vacancy rate at this point, right? And those individuals were now on the cusp of experiencing homelessness. And because they didn't have a lease to show, they weren't able to access long-term FEMA aid. And even if they could get their hands on a voucher, there was no housing supply to take that voucher to. So I think, as an emergency manager would say, we have to think about things in the steady state, because the extent to which we deal with our everyday disasters equips us to deal with those sudden and unexpected shocks when they do occur.
Great, thank you. So Sarah, I'm sort of moving to you. Give us a little perspective on the housing market. Can you provide some context on sort of the DC region's housing market and sort of what got us to the place we're in?
So first, let me say, as usual, I will rely heavily on more work that Peter has done, because my job is just to, I'm front lady. But I really first wanted to just say that I really appreciate, Kevin, the way you talked about some of the stresses that cities have, because we typically think about stresses in terms of the things that might be climate change or a stress being the high rates of poverty, but actually one of the greatest stresses our city and many other cities are facing is actually a stress that comes from growth. And growth is actually, in some ways, one of the big challenges that we face. It is infinitely better problem to have, to be trying to manage the consequences of growth, to having a net economic negative engine, but it is still nonetheless has very meaningful consequences, particularly for the populations we all care about. So let me just give you a little sense of that. The DC city's population has grown from 4.8 million in 2000 to 6.2 million in 2017. So that's a rather sizable amount of growth, and it's expected to continue. The DC region's expected to grow, our estimates are 38% over the next 2 decades, whereas Boston, New York, Philadelphia are all only expected to grow about 8%. So our region is not the most rapidly growing, actually, of many other cities. There, you could live in Seattle or San Francisco or some others where it's more challenging. But we face a continued pace of growth, and those were numbers all before some recent news in the headlines. But our housing production has not kept pace. So we were basically growing between during the 1990s at the same pace at which we were adding new housing supply. During the 2000s, we saw 7% growth in population. Since 2010, we saw 7% growth in population, but only 2.7% growth in number of housing units. So basically, from the recession on, we're not meeting the need of the region for growth. And we all know, if you drive down Mass Avenue, which part of the housing market that growth was serving. They're high-end units for the most part. And in particular, if you look at how the population is growing, the population has grown in 2 critical ways. It's grown at the top. In fact, we had 34% growth in the number of people who have incomes over $150,000 a year. But we also had 20% growth in the number of households that income was at the bottom. We saw 0 growth of population in the middle, which is America in DC is just like the rest of America, right? We're sort of the hollowing out of the center. So, and if you think about the consequences of all of that, it's not just that it's hard to get a house for the people who make over $150,000. It's hard to get a house for anybody, and the consequences are most severe for those at the bottom of the market. And the equity issues that are embedded in this are severe. So home values are significantly lower for black families, more of some of the data that Peter shared. The typical home value for a black household in DC is $250,000, but that's only 2/3 of the typical home value for white and Latino households. White households in the DC have net worth. This is the most shocking statistic for all. White households in the DC region have net worth 81 times greater than that of black households. The typical white household in DC had a net worth of $284,000. Typical black household, in contrast, had a net worth of $3,500. 80% of white residents with a high school diploma or less are homeowners. So these are people who only graduated from high school or other, and yet 80% of them, if they're white, own their homes, but fewer than 45% of comparable black residents. So I think the big point is that, and then if you look at the affordable housing gap and the risk, the availability of units, and Peter's done other work on this, the availability of units, people at the bottom, has continued to shrink. And that's not just because it's not just because of displacement and the concerns of pressure, but also the sort of falling out of the affordable housing stock of the units that are affordable people at the bottom as properties age and or become transformed, and we're not increasing the supply to meet that gap. I hope we can come back and talk about some ideas about what to do about that, but that gives you a little bit of a sense of the problem.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Janae, how does race play into this? Have we heard some of the stats? How does race play into this affordable housing conversation?
Yeah, that's thank you for that, the data that you shared. And I love this notion that resilience is the immune system of the city. And so as you think about race or racism, structural racism is the virus that keeps impacting and attacking the immune system of our city and of our systems across the board. And so that's how it plays into this whole issue here. And so if we do a root cause analysis to understand why we are where we are, we will see the impact of racism, structural racism, in our housing crisis, in our education systems, in our transportation systems, and so forth. And so what has happened is, if you look at, do you want me to keep going? I saw them right. What's happened is that there's been a history of policies at the federal, state, and local level that have caused us to be where we are. You've got redlining, I'm sure most folks know that, but that was an intentional decision to like not lend to certain communities. When you do that, and those certain communities are Black communities mostly, and Latinx communities, so no, don't lend there. So then you don't get the same start as others get to begin building the wealth, to get that $284,000 in wealth or in equity in your home. You just don't get that start. And then you've got players in the system, realtors, landlords, everybody's like playing this game, and it's rigged. And then when you think about affordable housing, when you have power in the hands of landlords, what does that do for people who live in those places? Like, that's a powerful story. I don't even have a lease to show. Imagine, like, who has the power there? Who can then benefit from that place? And so that, again, the bad behavior in fair housing, which I like to say fair housing isn't so fair because of who has the power. And then, of course, just decades and decades or centuries of disinvestment in communities. And so when you think about flight in and out, DC for me is really, really, it's an interesting place. I've recently moved to DC, to Ward 5, and so I'm literally in the middle of the gentrification. My place looks beautiful, and my street is a mess. Okay, period. And soon it's going to change, and I hate it. So I'm stuck. What do I do? But this is what's happening. There's this flight back into the city. I'm fortunate to be able to come in, but I'm like, just one.
Sorry, this is like totally but you made me think of something, which is just sort of this idea of migration, and you brought up flight, and so something that is so present but not present sometimes in our conversation about this is if you look back, not just, we often are talking about one transition, transition from one thing to the next, and not looking back a few generations. I know from some of the work we've been doing in Anacostia and having conversations with families. Oh yeah, my parents grew up in Anacostia, very different, a different migration ago, and that conversation. So how do you think about sort of patterns of migration or movement in populations that are like this?
Oh, wow. So, I mean, it's all impacted. It's all a part of what we're up against right now. And so you have sort of, again, as you think about integration and segregation, there was white flight, right? Whites, they left the city at first because all the Black people were moving in, or people of color moving in, and then they left the suburbs because the folks got pushed out of the city and went there. The other thing that was happening is not just about white folks, white flight. I like to talk about Black flight as well. So when you intersect class with race, and I, as a middle-class Black person, for example, can represent people who can just make it back into the city, I'm leaving as well. So all of my resources is also leaving that community. And so we grappling with this, it feels like an intractable problem, but that's why we have to fix systems, and too often we focus on people and what they're able to do or not do, or the bootstrapping mentality and all this stuff all the narratives that we've come up with, they're wrong. It's about the systems that we need to change. And racial equity is a way to get to that. And what that is a process and an outcome. When race is no longer a predictor of outcomes across systems, then we've achieved equity. But to do that, the process is we have to acknowledge the history and legacy of structural racism and the intentional decisions and choices we've made to get here.
Can you give that definition of racial equity one more time?
So, when race is no longer a predictor of outcomes, so when you can look across any system, education, health, transportation, housing, Black people have 2 to 7 times worse outcomes than white folks do, period. Okay, so that's the outcome. So when race is no longer a predictor of outcomes. And the process is the acknowledgement and action around the impact of the history and legacy of structural racism on our systems and on our people.
Thanks. So George, what does this look like on the ground for our low-income communities, communities of color, our communities east of the river? How is this impacting?
Sure, yeah. So I agree with everything that's been said. It's interesting. I tell 2 stories when I talk about where Bread for the City is these days, and one of them, they all relate to how we've pivoted around this concept of racial equity being really sort of the solution to the problems and not programs and the kinds of things that we historically have done. But probably about 6 or 7 years ago, one of my staff came to me. It was one of our young white staff came to me and said to me, and I had been to Bread maybe 14, 15 years by then, have you noticed that everybody who comes into Bread for the City is a person of color? And of course I had noticed that, but what she was really asking is, had I ever thought about that as, why is that? Why is it that only people who come to this agency seeking food or clothing or free health care or free legal services is a person of color? And I hadn't thought about that. And that's, you know, I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit that, because you can imagine I had been a black person the whole time. So, right. So it wasn't like I didn't have a reason to notice that. But the staff person went on and said to me, hey, you know, she said, and several of the staff said, hey, we just came from a training, a racial equity training, and we think that the issue is racism, and we should get smart about how racism works and why it causes everybody who turns to us to be a person of color. And so Brett sort of decided, so one of the things we did, we decided to send all of our, actually I went to a racial equity training with about 5 of my community members and 10 of my staff, because we wanted to go and see what was going on with this racial equity analysis that this training sort of offered. And a group called the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond did the training for us, and sure enough, we were blown away. I mean, you would think that, and probably 2/3 of the people who took the training were people of color, and of course, we people of color think that we understand racism and like experts. We didn't know anything. Like, we were just as uninformed and sort of, you know, the truth of the matter about systemic racism is that the issues and the solutions to them are not intuitive. And so we went through the training, and since then, we have pledged to and continue to send all of our staff through racial equity training, because we think it's a starting point for people who are working with us to understand that, yes, we offer programs, and yes, that Bread for the City is sort of a necessary evil in terms of having these core services that people living on low incomes need and turn to us for. But as the doctor said, it isn't because they're lazy or not smart or don't want to work or have caused these problems for themselves. It's because the systems have conspired against them, and we need to figure out how to deal with that. So the second thing that we've done is created an advocacy program that is an organizing system. So our advocacy program isn't sort of one where, although we do some talking head stuff where I show up at City Council and talk about public policy, but our real strategy is to work with community members to help them use their voices and tell their stories about how, you know, the affordable housing crisis is playing out in their communities and their lives, why they turn to a Bread for the City for services, you know, what are the economic forces and systemic forces that have pushed them into poverty and keep them in poverty, and what they need to be done to sort of reverse that. The last thing I want to say is that, so this idea of equity, and I agree, I mean, it is a fact that equity is both a process and an end, but when I think about equity, another way to think about how racial equity, how it sort of is important to understand is, I think in a lot of times what we're looking for is equality. We are looking for equal outcomes. We do want everybody to have equal access to housing, equal outcomes in education, but the way to equality is through equity. We need equitable solutions, equitable interventions, and that means you can't do the same thing for everybody. And that's one of the things that Bread is trying to do. And our organization is trying to get our staff to put their brains around. You know, historically, one of the reasons that nonprofits sometimes have just as much racism playing itself out through its system is because it tries to do the same thing for everybody coming to the door. So you set these rules up and says everybody's got to get equal treatment. Well, we all know that nobody needs the same thing. I mean, it may look like they need the same thing. People come in with low incomes, but if you say to everybody, I'm going to give everybody a 5-day supply of groceries, which is what Bread for the City does, well, there's some people who really need 10 days, and there's some people who maybe only need 3 days, and some people need an attorney down the hall, and some people actually need assistance with rental assistance. And so equitable solutions mean that you're going to meet people where they are, and you're going to. The last thing I want to say is that there's a term that I've sort of been playing with. I heard this term from, it was coined by a guy named John Powell, who from GARE, the Government Alliance of Racial Equity out in California, and he coined this term called targeted universalism. And targeted universalism is in effect what we need to do. We need to take our resources and target communities who are struggling, who have these gaps that the Urban Institute pointed out. We know they exist. If you talk to people who live in DC, white, black, whatever color, virtually everybody, 99% of the people in DC say, we don't like these disparities that play themselves out, these gaps. Like nobody wants those to exist. So we have consensus about that. But to limit those gaps, we have to target the people who are experiencing those gaps. And one of the challenges with that politically is that it's hard to say, I've talked to policymakers, and hard for them to go to Ward 3 or 1 or 2 and say, hey, you know, we're going to take our resources and target communities in 7 and 8. But there's going to be universal benefit. And that's what targeted universal is. We target the communities who are really struggling, who really need the support, and there's going to be universal impact for all of us. So,
Thank you very much. Wow, so we've heard a little bit about resiliency, we've heard about the data and the impact on housing and growth in the city, talked a little bit about racial equity and the impacts of structural racism on the system, talked a little bit on the ground, and a fascinating conversation we should come back to on how organizations that are working day to day in service think about how they take this structural approach to things and impact that into what they're doing. But if we think about sort of the city, right? And I think a couple of the stats that were thrown out here in terms of the stressors of growth. So if resiliency is about dealing with stressors with a weakened immune system, what are some of the stressors? And I mean, I think some of the numbers were DC's expected to have 1 million people by 2045. The median African-American household net worth in DC is on the path to 0 by 2053. You know, climate change actually has a significant impact on DC because of some of our low-lying areas near bodies of water, and which are primarily low-income areas of color, are actually significantly affected by floodplains. And then in the near term, we've got Amazon coming, and that opportunity of growth and stressor of growth, and then we also have opportunity zones. Back to this issue of targeting, we've targeted capital, maybe not with targeted necessarily engagement, and so how does that start to impact some of these things? So I wanted to sort of turn it over to Chanel and say, basically, you know, here's a question: sort of how do you think about, like, are there innovations that can support us in sort of accelerating closing this gap? And try to think. All the problems, you got the solutions. We figured the innovation person would give us all the solutions, right?
First of all, Lisa Hall should be sitting up here. I am a poor substitute for Lisa Hall. I will just be fair about that. You know, first of all, I thank you for the conversations, because I've got some great terms I should be using more effectively in my own institution in thinking about this conversation about equity. We just had a board meeting yesterday, and almost the whole board meeting was a conversation on the term equity and what it meant to different people. And one of the big takeaways I took from it is how many different definitions sat in that board meeting, and everybody sort of at the end came to the same conclusion, but it took about an hour and a half to get there because the terminology doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. So just as even our own civic participation piece of this is getting people to understand what we all mean by that term. Took us a while, and we've been at this for 5 years, so it was a good learning. I will say, I think one of the things that I might just think about is, from an innovation perspective, is really to think about how do we start with the outcome first. So if the outcome was, how do we take out, I loved your racism as a predictor of, race as a predictor of outcomes, then what might we do differently? Because sometimes we start with the program first without the outcome first. And the challenge with starting with the program first is we then try to fix programs. And we don't ever look back and say, how do I change the outcome, and might the programs not even exist? Maybe there should be other programs that should be there as opposed to the way we might approach it. So it's just a question. I don't know that we have a better answer. It's one of the things that we're going to test ourselves, and some of the work that Lisa and others are doing on opportunity zones is, what if we started with the outcome first of what we want to achieve there? How might we approach programming differently? And then who needs to be at the table to address that? And so with that, I would say 3 things happen. One, the outcome conversation forces us to address all of the inequities in the process. So where are the inequities? Let me start with a simple example. I don't have a great example to give this is what the model we should follow. But if we want to do business investment in Ward 7, in communities that are not already targeted to be invested in. And you start looking at how somebody's credit score is counted. You would look back and say, you pay more in interest if you're a person, let's not even take color, you live in this neighborhood and there's not enough banks in that neighborhood, you automatically pay more interest. I don't know, is that a better predictor of how somebody's credit works and how creditable they are because there's not a bank that chose to open a branch in that neighborhood and how they chose to make those decisions? And then when you look back at some of those numbers, you find that those communities that are paying higher interest are actually paying on a fairly regular basis and are paying at a higher interest on a regular basis, and they still have a bad credit score. So are we then looking at the data even in the right way? Or are we assuming that the data is being collected is equitable in the first place? And so I think those are questions, and I know Urban's been looking at this in much deeper way than we have, and they've done a really good job of it, but these are questions that we have to ask if we want to get to innovation. To reconstruct innovation, you have to deconstruct all of the other stuff to say where might we do innovation differently if we were to take away and answer those questions. And then who are the people at the table? Do we bring the private sector to the table? Because a lot of times we sit in our own silos. The government brings the private sector to the table, but they come because the government wants them to come. And then the nonprofits largely talk to the private sector, and I was one of those, so that want money from them. And so you have this conversation that is sort of not a real conversation about the outcome and what we're trying to achieve, but all we're in it because we all want something out of it, you know, the government. So the question is, how do we break down those silos of that conversation? And then we can get to innovation. So I worry, I'm not going to answer your innovation question because there's no single point solution to this, in my view. What it is a process by which we approach it differently.
What sort of collaboration, you talked a little bit about different sectors and collaborations. What sort of approaches to collaboration have you seen that work?
I'll give you an example from a different project we're working on that doesn't actually have to do with racial equity in DC, but we've been doing this project on blockchain, for example, and we had to bring the technology community, the business community, and the civil society community to the table. When we first did that collaboration, nobody spoke the same language. So the tech people all thought they were being fair. They were like, yeah, the algorithm's great. We've been looking at the data. And it's like, then we break it down. And it's like, so the civil society sat at the table and said, well, what data are we talking about? And then how do you have that conversation? And the business community said, well, what are we funding? But it took 3 conversations to get to the point of saying how to collaborate. And then the outcome of that was, here's the ethical pledge or the ethics process you have to go through in order to, if you're going to build blockchain that is inclusive, here's what it looks like. And now everybody's like, what are the steps I need to take to get there? So that was a collaborative outcome, but it took us 3 conversations to get there in the first place because we were all talking a different language. And after that first 3, the acceleration was a lot faster because then everybody was on the same page. But you can't speed up the process if you don't actually have the conversation first. Then you can speed up the process. But we tend to want to do it at an accelerated pace without knowing that the conversation is not always the same, which is, I think, Dr. Queen's point, is that we have to be able to break down these problems. So I would say the collaborations work, and why universities are good for this in many ways is that we're not in the game of any of those things. We're just trying to, we can ask the tougher questions and we can bring people that may not agree with you to the table, but at the same time, we're just a neutral body that's like, okay, well, let's have a forced conversation here that we can hopefully just lead to a transparent outcome. All we care about from our perspective is, can we at least report the things that we're seeing and say these were the conversations that took place without being held to why did you come up with this or why didn't you come up with this. But that transparency and the role of a university is critical, and I think it's one of the roles that we all need to step back into, which is how do we play a role where we can bring different players together to have these conversations.
So, and you think the university can play a key role in holding that sort of objective outcome out in front of us that allows, I love this idea that having a clear outcome and starting with the outcome allows you to innovate because then everything else becomes movable to achieve the outcome as you look through it. George, sort of looking a little bit at like, you talked a little bit about some of the changes you started to make in your organization, but what sort of systemic changes do you think are needed to address this?
Well, I completely agree with this, starting with the end in mind. And I think that, I think all of the sectors have a role to play in an anti-racist city, a racially just city, which is what we should be envisioning in DC. But first among equals is the government. They have the biggest systems in most of them. And so I think one of the big roles that the rest of the community can play, importantly, the sort of for-profit sector can play, is to empower the government, authorize the government to talk candidly about what has to happen. I think that the government is afraid to talk about what has to happen to have a racially equitable city, because it is about targeting people who aren't paying the most taxes or don't live on certain parts of the town. But I think that that's a big challenge on a macro level, and it's the conversation that Bread for the City has been trying to push in the spaces that we're allowed to enter anyway, and when people will listen to them. And at the same time, we have to, at our own organizations, really sort of do the same thing. We have to sort of make our institutions anti-racist. So all the sectors have that challenge, and what would that take? And a lot of times it just means that you need to sort of build your systems around the people you're serving and not the other way around. And we think we are, but if you look at most institutions, their systems work so that the institution can function best. And they have what we like to say, they oftentimes have gatekeeping mechanics to them. Which is to say, we are the ones who have the resources, and we are the gatekeepers for at the Bread for the City, whether you receive clothing or food or access to an attorney, we set the time for it, we tell you how long you can see them, we tell you all the proofs you need, and if you can't jump through all those hoops to get those services, the gate is closed. And so we think institutions have to turn their systems into gateway systems. And so it's a gateway to access. And so what time do you need this service? What can we do to make sure that you don't need the proofs? You don't have to bring 10 proofs and bring your ID and make 6 trips back to us. We had a system at one time. So one of the things that happened on a sort of quasi-macro level is that about 10 years ago, or for the first 10 to 15 years I was at Bread for the City, the food pantries, many of the food pantries in DC required people to have a referral to get food. So, and I hate that whole concept. You have to prove, too often people with low incomes have to prove they have low income. If there's nothing, it's already sort of indignant that you are living on a low income, but now I have to go and verify it by bringing you some proof, testifying that I'm poor, right? So anyway, so we nonprofits doing God's work or whatever, we're requiring people to bring something that says I'm poor. And what people were being required to do in many instances is to go to Bread for the City and get a statement from us that said this person is a low-income person and you should let them get food. So they go to the place for food. They say, oh, we can't help you until you come with a referral. But Bread for the City will write a referral to you. So you go back to Bread, you go to Bread for the City, then you go back to the place, turn the referral, and get the food. So that's gatekeeping, right? And so the sector, we called the sector together and said, this doesn't make any sense. Why are we making, the people who are least able to do that transverse to get services are the people we serve. They have the least resources. How does it make sense to you to send them to me, spend the bus fare, then send them back to you for this? And so we've done away with that system in the food spaces. And that's the kind of sort of anti-racist work, that's the kind of what the trainers that we use call undoing racism. That's how you undo racism. You take these systems and turn them upside down and make sure that they work for the people you serve. So,
just one last question. Do you think the gap's closable? Like living it every day. What do you have hope?
I always quote Dr. King in 1964 when he received the Nobel Peace Prize. He said that there's nothing new about poverty. But the truth of the matter is we have the resources to end poverty. I think that's more true in Washington, D.C. than any other city in the country. We have the right politics. Again, 99% of the people in this city say they're liberal. And the 1% who doesn't confess to not being liberal. So everybody in this is a city of all liberals who have liberal politics. We've got tons of money. and we've got a finite challenge. I mean, you saw the numbers at Urban. Those numbers can be changed. I think we can end poverty in this city within the next 20 to 25 years if we take it on.
Wow. So Dr. Queen, what kind of work do we need to do internal to organizations to sort of strengthen our contributions to this? You've been doing a lot of work on this inside an organization. How do organizations think about racial equity work to really drive their practice and contribution?
Oh, that's a big question. Call me afterwards, we can talk. I just want to name something that George raised and pivot to what institutions can do. What you're naming here around gatekeeping and so forth is about a shift in power, and we have to be real about the fact that there is loss associated with this shift in power. So there are people, including yourselves, who don't want to give that up. And if we're not real with that, we're going to be in for a rude awakening. So some of the reckoning that we need to do about the history of racism in our country and who it has benefited, how and how much, is it's scary for people. It is terrifying because when you build a system on free labor for so long and you don't have to actually be excellent in achieving the wealth that you've achieved, you can actually be mediocre in doing that. That's a problem. And so now we're asking for excellence to undo racism because it actually impacts us all. We've all been dehumanized by it. Some folks may have a little bit more, but we don't have the most that we can have. So it's a loss in power, and people are not happy about that. And so you've got to go through this personal process to face that and buy into this notion of racial equity and that we can actually close gaps and so forth. That we see that all the time. And so to the institution, that's part of what we've had to do inside. A lot of our work has been outside across the nation in cities with people, and we were doing a lot of our work but from a race neutral lens. And then we started talking about it race is important, and we realized, but we were still being racist. We were still practicing anti-Blackness, which is what this whole paradigm is built upon. And so to undo that, we had to take a personal look at ourselves. And that's actually countercultural that's counter to our institutional cultures. It's that's personal, this is business, right? So what do you need to do in your role? And what are we doing for our institution? We actually had to do personal work, and the leadership had to buy in. You are really good friends with my CEO, and so shout out to Ben Hecht, who is a white man who said, I was doing good work for a long time, and I would say I reject that race is a part of this. Well, as we internally did a root cause analysis about systems, why are the systems, people like to say broken, I like to say they're not broken. They're designed to get the results they achieve, like HIFIS, adaptive leadership, so give proper credit. They're not. They're designed to give those results because we weren't talking about racism as a root cause to the outcomes that we constantly would see. And so we had to do that root cause analysis as a leadership team, not just staff members who went to training and came back and said, hey guys, this is important, but the leadership had to do it. And if your leadership is resistant, you need a critical mass. And so it is actually personal work, to your point, George Jones. We have PSEP, People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, and racial equity. So we did a lot of competency building to understand, to have a common language, because we were getting lost in translation. We were talking about equity, we were talking about equality, and it wasn't racial equity. So we had to have a common language. We had to move beyond race neutral. We had to do work on the inside, and we actually had to take some risks that, with our board and other folks who supported us, there's going to be rejection because what? Power is lost. Asking people to shift their perceptions in the way that they think about people was a huge deal because we haven't had to do it. And then the other thing that we did, and in institutions, you got to put racial equity in the center. And what that means is the people who have had the worst outcomes, the people who came into the door every day, they actually have to be centered in your work and seen as human beings. So I ask you, what do you believe about folks Black folks or Latinx folks or people of color, and why do you believe it? Interrogate that. And then that will permeate through your role as leaders in your institutions. And so that's how we got started. And there's so much more we can share, but I'll leave you with that.
Maybe just a little thought on how has it affected the organization? How do you see it working that work? Yeah.
It's transformed it. You said it. It's transformed it.
In what ways have you seen?
Well, I just as a partner of the organization, the projects that you led in the past were projects in cities around access to the workforce development system and community development. Now the projects on workforce and community development have race at the core of them, and they are working on how understanding in each of the models they're using where the racial equity questions that we were talking about before are embedded in the workforce system and the community development system that you're working on, for example.
So what are some of the examples you're seeing from the other 100 resilient cities around the
Well, and I'll
around
give
the world?
I'll give one example from 100 Resilient City, but also actually from lots of other work that we do as
And
well.
which one's your favorite, by the way?
Which is my favorite? That's not hard. That one's not hard. I should just disclaimer here. The Urban Institute is the formal evaluator for the Rockefeller Foundation of the 100 Resilient Cities program for them to help them understand what difference it's made. And we are also looking at a number of the different cities, including the DC team. But I was actually going to draw an analogy between something we saw in that process and a broader set of the conversations we've been having here. So what makes a difference for racial equity? What makes a difference for resilience? One key word that keeps coming up in our work is participation. Who's at the table? So in one of the 100 resilient cities, the city of Fresno, the state of California was convinced to have a cap and trade dollars set aside to be used for a broader idea, not just energy, climate resilience, but a broader idea of resilience. And the city of Fresno had $70 million in funding that came from that bond issue, and they used a participatory budgeting process to figure out there was going to be a high-speed trail link that's going to be in their city in probably about 10 years from now, probably. But the planning process, they chose to use a participatory process about how they were going to use the money to plan for that. And all kinds of people who aren't normally at the table were at the table. And guess what? The solutions they chose were different than the solutions they might have chosen if we had a, city planning office do it all by themselves. Nobody does it all by themselves, but you know what I mean. It was a much more empowering. We talk at Urban a lot about participatory justice. Can you imagine a world in which you sit down between the police department and a low-income community and say, how would you like to be most effectively, most safely policed? What would come to good outcomes in your community? And can we test this notion? The Urban Institute does research. When we go into public housing communities all around the city, and it's a group of predominantly white researchers from the Urban Institute doing that, you're going to get one answer. What if instead the people who were doing the data collection and helping you interpret the question, maybe even helping to shape the questions, were residents of those communities? You get different answers when you do that. So I think this kind of interesting idea of participation and participation with an influence, not just a input process, is a theme that I think knits what George was talking about how you interact with the city and a lot of other things. And I guess the other thing I would say as a sort of overarching goal is, and I think you were talking about this, if what you care about is the outcome, I mean, one of the reasons Peter did the equity indicators is when you can go from saying, I can describe a disparity to you all day long. In fact, we have a website filled with descriptions of disparities. What's so much more interesting is the ability to say, okay, if there are 24,000 more people who need a degree, and then you have collective impact models and collaborations across silos sitting there saying, what would it take to get 24,000 people? The city of St. Louis had a process where they were looking at inequities, and they were realizing that their city was having a very hard time doing business attraction. And what they realized was that it was because they didn't have the talent pool they needed. Well, they were a predominantly minority community, and they weren't producing the kind of degrees. So they looked at it and they realized we need to have 55,000 more degrees, 12,000 more associate's degrees, and somebody did the math, 41,000 four-year college degrees. And then everybody sat around the table saying, what would it take to get to that number? And you're looking at who their population is, suddenly you're in profoundly segregated communities thinking about educational outcomes. So there is power in that target setting and then the collective impact model around it.
Interesting. So Kevin, a little bit about, for the city, what kind of partnerships are needed to move forward, to move this forward, to move things forward in the resiliency plan?
It's a great question, and now you all know that I'm sitting on the stage with our evaluator, so hopefully I answer well.
Not me.
Is Carlos here? in any case, I think this conversation about starting with the outcomes is kind of at the core of the whole resilience process. So one of the things that we did is we came up with these big kind of bold questions. We had some around governance, some around climate change, economic mobility, technological change, and then a special focus around the Anacostia River and the neighborhoods on either side, recognizing that many of those forces come together in that place. And then we convened people, and we brought together about 100 different folks. There's some familiar faces in the room that participated in the process. I see Scott over there from 11th Street Bridge. And we organized each other around these open-ended questions, the outcomes, right? Instead of the kind of normal, here's one of my 63-odd agencies, let's figure out how to fix this existing program. And that enabled us to have conversations together. And I was surprised that we also were able to convince so many folks to volunteer to do so much work. A lot of the district staff may have been voluntold a little bit, but I think they were excited too. But folks did best practice research, literature reviews. We even had a group that biked up and down the Anacostia River and mapped public access points. And then we convened everybody together for what we called finals week and said, what did you learn and where do you think the opportunities are? And now we're organizing around those learnings and saying, great, what are the big ideas? And many of them are, in fact, partnership-based. And I think when I think, Sonala, was your point, when you take these kind of outcomes as the starting point, that enables you to find the partners. And in a city like the District of Columbia, where we have so many great institutions and so much work, it's not hard to find folks that are interested in and working on the same things.
So like, in terms of moving to I just want to ask a couple of sort of open-ended questions, and we'll open up to the audience so folks want to start preparing their most challenging questions for the panel as we can help solve all these issues. Two things that sort of have been obviously in the news a lot recently: Amazon first, and then opportunity zones. But so Amazon, what impact does Amazon have on the system as it relates to many of these conversations that we've been having? I know anyone jump in, but I know you've done a lot of work on this.
So yeah, we've just announced a big project to look at the impact of Amazon on the housing markets in the region. And in my chronic optimism, I think that this region has an affordable housing crisis. I was describing one of its key critical causes is the mismatch between supply and demand. We have not been producing the number of units. We are going to grow the demand side of that equation dramatically because of Amazon. It was already going to continue to grow, but now it's going to grow at a much faster pace. So I like to think of this as, how do you turn this into an opportunity? The mind has been focused by the rapid, it's not just Amazon, it is the other firms that will be attracted around Amazon. It is the billion-dollar investment in a tech campus in Northern Virginia, as opposed to, which I think probably they had wanted to do for a while, but it forced the mind. I mean, it's a whole series of things that are going to mean that potentially good vitality and opportunity in our region, but also almost certainly, if you think about where the commuting patterns are from Ward 7 and 8, from Petworth, from PG, obviously throughout Arlington County, those places are going to have enormous pressure on home values and house prices. Well, if you're an affordable housing advocate, and you've been trying to argue, you're fighting over scraps, additional incremental units for every how many we produce at the high end, will we do a little bit here. There is NIMBYism, if you will, at the high end of people who don't want higher density where they live, but you also have low-income neighborhoods that are just terrified of additional pressure and gentrification. And so what all that adds up to is, slow, very gradual constraint on production. Well, what if instead the business community were to say, you know what, we need to be able to attract people here to these jobs, and we want production, but we realize the only way we're going to get it is if it's balanced. If we are producing affordable units at the bottom of the market, if we are supporting inclusionary zoning programs. Maybe I'm optimistic, unduly so, but part of the goal of this project we're leading, where we're going to figure out how many additional units do we need in Montgomery County and Fairfax, region by region, and then say which policy tools will get you there, and then try to get to a slate of tools and get the local, regional, all of the county executives to pledge to producing their share in an ideal world. And then you have, this is the policy tools that will get you to that share at all different incomes. And you have an agenda that the business community can either say, I'm for it all, or I'm not going to get any. And that's what I'm hopeful about. Does this moment force us to think differently and regionally in a way we never have before?
I just want to add to Sarah's point, and I think the question I would ask is, how would we have taken kind of the California example you made and said, if we were to do a community-oriented approach to how we were going to bid for Amazon, what would that have looked like? And we didn't ask that question. We're still a very top-down process, which the city is taking the leadership, the Economic Development Agency is doing all of the work. Maybe we bring the community in after we've designed the plans to make sure they're okay with some portions of it. But what if you turned it around and said, okay, if the community were part of the bidding process, what would it look like, and how might we do it slightly differently, and what would that look like? I think government leaders need new tools and new models in which to do that. I'm not blaming the government. I'm just saying that I think we all operate on the same model that we've known for 25 years, and we tweak it here and there. We maybe add a few more people to the decision-making process. But at the end of the day, the model's exactly the same that we've always done. No offense. I know I haven't read the resiliency plan, so I apologize to start with.
It's not
published yet.
Okay. But I think those are the questions that we should be asking. And then the last piece, and I would just add to Kevin's comment, is that how do we allow the government to test things without getting focused on failure and saying, if we test it, we try it, we moderate it, we test it again. It would be great for Kevin and George to work together and figure out what those models look like, because we don't know the answers. And if the only way to be innovative is to actually fail. But we're so afraid of failure, and we so beat up on the government when they fail, that we're never going to get to the point of innovation, because all of innovation is about failure.
So speaking about innovations and new things, opportunity zones, how do you guys see impact of opportunity zones in what's happening?
Anybody else want to? Sure. So if I were sitting in Capitol Hill or the Treasury designing a program, this would not be the program I would design. It is probably going to end up to be more dollars into community economic development than anything I've spent 30 years of my career trying to design or help. And it's potentially not helpful to a neighborhood if the result of it is a bunch of bad deals get done, property values spike, they collapse, and then the neighborhood is left alone. And there are places where I am pretty sure I could tell you already that's going to be the consequence. But it doesn't have to be that way. It certainly doesn't have to be that way everywhere. And so it is the tool we have on the table right now. And so how do you help the people who are trying to do good with this resource, and it is essentially a subsidy, use it in ways that you can, that will be most beneficial. So one of my colleagues has produced an analysis by census tract of where capital is already flowing. If you have a neighborhood that is already seeing a huge infusion of capital, where you've seen a dramatic increase, or shift, for example, in the racial composition in that neighborhood, that's a place that's probably already kind of hot, and we ought to be a little bit worried about having the government cheer as the next new developer comes in to build a mixed income project there, because it probably is going to have some of the displacement concerns we have. But if you're a government that has access to tools and data, you can see where are the places. How do you layer your workforce development programs along with the tax subsidy so you're actually using it as an economic engine you can hitch on to? So there's a lot of work to do, and unfortunately not a lot of time to do it in, to help the public officials and the mission investors and the CDFIs and others take advantage of this tool in a way that is going to have the better possible outcomes and mitigate how much of the worry I have about some of the consequences.
We're seeing the same. I mean, Corey Booker's team is also worried about the exact same thing, right? They're worried that the idea of what was created and what's actually going to happen are not the same things. But I think it's one of the things that Lisa Hall's been leading for us, and we've been working with Urban and others, is how do we make sure impact is at the core of opportunity zones? That everybody's talking about opportunity zones from an investment perspective. We're going to push the impact perspective. Like, the whole point of the opportunity zone legislation was that we improve neighborhoods, and yet that portion of the legislation was stripped out on reporting on improvement. And so
No data.
No outcomes.
No data transparency. So what city governments can actually do is ask for a little bit of that data transparency. There's a role for government here, especially at the city and state levels, to say, give us the data on what you say you're doing for impact. If the IRS isn't going to do it, but the states can definitely do it, and the cities can definitely do it. And then the second is, as a community, all of us, we need to keep asking for it. So every time somebody talks about opportunity zones, the next question is, what's the impact, right? And not, it's our collective impact challenge of asking for that question, because letting that pass and be happy that more money got invested without knowing what the impact of it was, we're gonna lose in that process. And third is, I do think there are demonstration projects we can do out of this, right? There's no requirement, so that kind of leaves you an opportunity to test ideas. But could we try different demonstration projects? We did a convening with real estate investors, and what was very interesting is many of them, surprisingly, a lot more of them were interested in the impact portion. Yeah. They just don't know how to do it. And there was actually a very good conversation. So I think there's an opportunity to bring different people together to say, how do you do impact? And maybe it's not perfect, but at least we start the process.
Great, thanks. So I'll open it up to some questions from the audience. Yes, sir. Front row. I think it's right behind you. I think they got a mic right behind you.
Thank you. My name is Vernon Oakes, and I have a property management business in Washington, D.C. It's a great conversation. I'm glad City First is doing this. I started my banking with them 25 years ago when they first got started. But I learned about housing co-ops as I managed them, and I was wondering, and I want to shout out for Anita Bonds, who created a limited equity cooperative task force to look at how to preserve the ones we have and create some additional ones. But I'm wondering if any of you have looked at this model, because there's some research that suggests they were much better than particular apartment buildings and some other models.
So I'm not going to be able to give enough detail. I know some of my colleagues have done a lot more work, but I want to just talk about that model in the context of this thing we were talking about inclusive development. So think about Ward 7 and 8, and if the Bridge Park, which we've been working with, building bridges across the river, to think about the consequences for those neighborhoods. Lisk, and we all remember Ornmenta fondly, really was a leader in this, thinking about let's assume that we have a big impetus for development into that neighborhood. How do we now, thinking ahead of that, make sure that the longstanding residents of that community are able to be the ones who take advantage of the rising value of properties in that community? And limited equity co-ops are one of, and other types of land trusts and other vehicles are tools that we may have to try to make sure that the existing residents of the community, if they can be ones who benefit when the property rises, rather than somebody else who comes in. They may benefit actually from some sort of shared equity, or they may just benefit by the preservation of affordability of that house in the neighborhood over time. So there are a whole set of what I would call housing tools in the toolbox. DC has more of them already than many jurisdictions do that we could use very intentionally. So when we see neighborhoods that are at risk of rapid gentrification, we build a strategy out ahead. And I think that's one of the possible tools.
My name is Omar Hakim. I'm an architect and designer that runs a nonprofit design center here in DC, and I love the high-level conversation and the kind of broad brushstrokes that that you guys paint, because it allows us to kind of dream beyond your specific words. Talking about shifts in power, talking about innovation, and some of the systems that keep pervasive poverty in place. But I want to ask a kind of specific, pointed question, especially for DC residents, because I think we've all been to really amazing ANC meetings, and we've also been to really tough, very long. Bo, I've been to some with you, seen you there presenting. I know you gotten beat up a little bit, but it seems like a system that has potential and that it's operating at a grassroots scale. But it also seems like, and I'm coming at this more from just a resident, I'm a resident of Ward 4, a broken system or an underutilized system that could offer some opportunity to shift power or to, if when Ormenta made that commitment to the catchment area of the Bridge Park, how would that be structured, right? And Scott has done a great job with the focus groups and other outreach activities, but I'm wondering if you all have any thoughts about ANCs, good, bad, how could we fix them? Is any of this, I'm just kind of curious with your minds up there where we could go with that.
Yeah, I can start and you guys can chip in. I actually think that personally, I think ANCs provide a tremendous opportunity. I think it's underutilized and inconsistent is part of the problem. And I think that it's back to, we talked a little earlier about having a common language. You need to have a common language. You also have to have a common set of facts and information. And so I think a lot of times, you have ANC meetings taking place and the disparities in actual access to information and time spent on what the issue is. I know the example I'll use is Walter Reed. Going to a project that's going to take 10 years and dramatically change a neighborhood, and sitting down with an ANC that's supposed to make a decision about a $2 billion development, and half the people in the ANC said they never read the proposal, right? So the differences of the information that people have to them. And I know there's a bill moving right now in the council about creating a new office of sort of education to help ANCs have the tools they need to be able to effectively evaluate. And I think it comes back to this question about power, right? So just putting someone up in a seat and saying, make a vote, doesn't actually give them power. Giving them knowledge and access to the resources of the information they would need to make an informed decision, I think is actually how you start to shift that power. So my thought is that there's a lot of room in that structure if it can be moved to start to shift some of that dialogue. But I think now oftentimes it functions less about solutions and more about obstruction, and that doesn't actually give it the strength it needs. Yeah.
Just go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say that I've been to enough ANC meetings to know that sometimes it sort of looks like just a group of people working at the program level. And I think I go back to this, even though you talked about being granular, I go back to this thing is, if this city decides that it is going to have an inclusive city, one that eliminates race-based disparities, that is the premise, the macro premise, then all the other institutions underneath it, ANCs, nonprofits, whatever, if you need to assess whatever your positions are around that premise. If we're all saying we can't have disparate outcomes anymore, those conversations should all change, because if you look at an ANC conversation now, it is so focused on the interest of the handful of people sitting in the room. It is easily imaginable that it isn't aligned in any way with some premise that we don't want gentrification to be accelerated or people of color to lose more access. Like nobody has said that that's the rule. Nobody has said that you can't have those conversations in those spaces, whether it's the ANC in Ward 1 or 8. And we need this community, this city, to say we're creating a city that is inclusive, resilient for everybody. And so your conversations at the ANC level need to suggest that, or it needs to be called on that. Like, haven't we said we're not going to do something that's going to cause disparities again? If the conversation is going down that road, your ANC should be called on it, your nonprofit should be called on it, your school, all the microsystems in this city. So,
great. Other questions? Yes, Dessa.
Hi, Deza Sealy, Gotham Urban Ventures development and consulting firm. I have a question for Dr. Queen, and I'm interested in the internal impact of the racial equity work that you're doing within your organization and how that's changed the way that you work.
We shifted our leadership structure to work on this notion of shared power, right? So what does that look like? I mean, we're actually still evolving, but we went from sort of a traditional bureaucratic, there's the CEO, and on down to while the CEO is our rep and he is accountable to our board, we have a resources and results team, which is the management team of the organization. It's a 9-person team. We're trying to figure out, is that the right number? But it's a mix of folks at different levels who are at the table, and we have a voting, we have committees, and we have a voting process, and can he get vetoed? He never actually has to get vetoed, which is nice. But that's one of the ways that we've shifted power in our organization. And another thing that we've done internally is we have tools or things that we can use when we're having conversations and we're making decisions. We'll say, let's take an equity pause to see if we've actually, who's at the table. I love the table. Collective impact is my jam, with race in the middle. But who is at the table? Whose voices are being prioritized? Whose voices are being silenced? And so we just have a simple set of questions that we ask and answer to check our blind spots because we can't see those things. And then I think the third thing is, and very practically, we're okay prioritizing people of color in our procurement processes. And so 43% of our dollars, our contract dollars, have gone to Black entrepreneurs and service providers. And that was a huge shift. And so we named it, and we said, all right, this is what we're going to do. For our cohorts, like you said, we do a lot of convening of groups of cities and city leaders, and we have what we call cohort leads. In our city bank is one of our members, and in our city accelerator, our cohort leads are people of color. Our topics are around procurement to open up opportunities for people of color, small business opportunities in cities for people. See, because putting people of color in the center will actually help us to get to results, because you can't get to results without addressing race. Like I said, those gaps, the constant factor in those gaps are around, is because of racism. And so centering folks is what we've been doing internally, and so that's, it's happening throughout. And we also have lots of trainings and things of that nature.
Great. We have other questions? Yes.
Hello, my name is Miriam Warren. I work at a public affairs consultancy here in town, and I've really appreciated everything that you've said. I'd like to try to start small in my own environment, and I'd say that we've done a lot. We have a diversity and inclusion working group. We've really tried to prioritize equality and inclusion in our company. We go to job fairs where we think it would increase the possibility. We issue, the job positions broadly, and it's not moving quickly enough. Are there other tactics that you might recommend? I know this is getting very, very micro, but that you might recommend for a company that's local that could really be making great strides, because the intention's there, the awareness is there, but we're not seeing the results we'd like to see.
I'll just make one comment that not every organization is going to be living cities, but there are ways to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion that is beyond the talent end. We all tend to think about this as changing the composition of who's at the table, and that's critically important. But actually, in some ways, that's a result of the work we do. So we've been trying to think a lot about what projects are we doing? Well, we have to respond to what funders have funded us for. So we put a small amount of our own resources into our structural racism research group that can work without an outside grant to do some work, and starts to create bodies of work that we have that we can publish on, that then others can see and engage and partner with us around. Similarly, what language do you use? Urban's very good at describing disparities, but when you describe something as a fact, you're actually not only not acknowledging the systems that created it, but in some ways you're giving it some legitimacy in its. So we've started to look at language guides, how we talk about the findings that we get from our research, how we talk about justice-involved populations. You say a woman earned something, that's very different than you say a woman is paid something. You're conveying something different about those two things. So we start to do that, and honestly, jury's still out, but the hope is that when you do different work, the talent pipeline, retention, attraction, all of that actually flows from that as well. So just a way to think about in each and every project you do, is there something different to do that you can then bring this question to?
Just really quick, that language shift is so powerful because it's also the difference between, like, we all talk about access to, opportunity for, but that actually doesn't get the, like, you don't get to secure it, right? So how do we move from access to security? And so when you start thinking about all the work that we're doing is for people of color, right? And we're not just focused on sort of what they can't do and what they need. It's like we're just doing this in service of because it's the right thing to do. That also just starts to help change our minds about it. So I love the language tools and things.
Great. I just want to give our panelists any closing thoughts. It's been a wide-ranging conversation, so thank you. You guys have any sort of closing thoughts, things you'd want to share with this group?
Well, I hear that half the groups or half the organizations that try to do anti-racist work or try to make their organizations anti-racist quit. It's really hard work. It's difficult to have institutions to change the sort of scores of years of doing things the old way, and it's, the muscle memory is hard to overcome. So it's a real thing. It's hard to change people's views. I think that a tipping point is what we're trying to work for in a city like DC, which is to say enough organizations like the young lady who just stood up saying we're doing this, like when we get a critical mass of organizations who are doing it and committed to doing it, that we will then start to see systemic reform. Because when we're sort of doing it as just one agency, it is really just one agency trying to do it, and we are not going to, a Bread for the City or no other institution is going to make DC an anti-racist city by just doing its own work. It has to be sort of a critical mass of us all sort of talking about how to have our institutions be anti-racist, and it needs to start with the government. So,
I just want to end on your note of optimism before, because we do live in a city that is economically growing, that has extraordinary resources, that is diverse in ways that represent the future of our country, and it becoming ever more so in many ways. And so we have a lot of, and we're visible to a lot of the country. If we do things right, we have the ability to influence and create models that can grow to other places. So we've got enormous assets of community and rich history here that we can build on. And so I just, we spent a lot of time talking about how deep the challenge is, how far we have to go, but we should feel kind of good about this town's chances, and this, I would argue, region's chances, because it needs to work regionally to be successful for making progress.
I'd just add that relationships are an underutilized currency in this work, and so we need to lean into our relationships because they're the currency of our kingdom, and they'll help us get to those results.
Nothing bigger to add other than to say I think we have the power to make the change. If we're going to wait for other people to do it, it's not going to happen. But there's just, even up on this panel, if all of us were trying to work together even on one thing, we could shift that. So I really want to thank City First a lot for all of the work that they've done in the city for 25 years, because had it not been for that, we wouldn't be having this conversation if it wasn't for them. So thank you.
Yeah, I would just add to a point that you made. We're the nation's capital, and there's a real opportunity to use the assets that we have to lean in and really address all of these things. And I think we have the brain power, we have the resources, like you said, and we're going to do it. And when I think of resilience, I look at the cities that these issues were laid bare when a disaster did strike. And I think now is the time to do it before it becomes even more painfully obvious that these are the types of things we need to work on.
Well, first of all, I want to thank our panelists. This is a phenomenal conversation, and just give them a round of applause. I just want to echo. I think what you guys have said, and closing it out is that, you know, I think a big part of this is awareness and raising our collective awareness about things. And I think that awareness extends not just to the challenges that we face, right, but also to the opportunities that those things present. And I think we're, as has been pointed out here, we're very positioned in an amazing, lucky way in some ways, in this, especially in this region and in this city, where many of the things we're talking about as shocks to the system are things that also bring a tremendous amount of resources. When we can say the creation of new jobs and the creation of additional capital are the shocks to our system that potentially have some significant consequences that we need to address, but also present tremendous opportunities that we can harness. And so I think it all begins with awareness, and I think awareness of the good and the bad, and the opportunity to play a role in that. So just grateful for the conversation today, and this dialogue that starts. It all starts somewhere. It starts with conversations and starts in relationship, and hopefully moves to collaboration that can help us all create a more equitable and more resilient future. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Great honor.
Phenomenal job. You all can sit or go, whatever. I have to say, first of all, I now know what resilience is and why it's important for both our city and institutions. And I'll say as well, for City First Foundation, this is exactly what we wanted to do, to have this exact conversation, to span from the big picture of systems to our own systems, right? Whether it's our institution and what we might need to be thinking about differently there so that we can be more impactful, or how we collaborate and who we bring to the table. So this is the exact kind of conversation that I think is important. And frankly, I hope you feel challenged. I hope you feel a little bit uncomfortable even, but I also hope you feel a little bit inspired to say, okay, what am I gonna do? What am I gonna do when I go back to my workplace, to my home, to challenge how my own balance of power, or the balance of power within my institution, so that we can erase that 81X, Peter, that you referred to, and that we opened our conference a full year ago about, talking about that difference in economic power. All right, so again, I want to thank our panel just once more, because I am fully loaded. Y'all better watch out now. Find them, collaborate with them. Let's make a difference in this beautiful city and make it more equitable. All right, so you know, we're getting ready to have I think some cocktails and hors d'oeuvres will be passed around. We're going to break to the next portion of our program today, so feel free to stand up and breathe a little bit. The cocktails, I think, are at hors d'oeuvres. Whoa. Upstairs, we shifted. We're going to do it upstairs. Okay. Head upstairs. Thank you very much.
Public service announcement. The bar is also open. Ladies and gentlemen, the bar downstairs is now open as well. Once again, the bar downstairs, left of the stage, is now open.
Summit. I'm not starting. Is Brian? Don't you have, oh, well. So there's another. Me, right?
Miss Gloria.
Good evening, good evening. Good evening. Can I get your attention, please? I know you are mingling with phenomenal folks. Get your attention up here, please, everyone. Everyone, Todd, I'm gonna start calling you out by name because I know all of you. Okay. Let's see. Priya? Okay. Can I get your attention? Thank you. Thank you. Kim? Thank you. All right, so welcome back. We're back at the City First Forum, and we're transitioning. First of all, thank you, and I do understand these rooms are powerful. I think for some of us it's a reunion, but I think more important than just seeing people who you haven't seen in a while is figuring out how you're going to work with them or inspire them or challenge them to do the type of work we were just talking about and the type of work our city and specifically our communities need. So we'll perhaps get you back to that, but we need to do some other things before that. And I guess this afternoon really is one of coalition building. That's what you guys are doing, and engagement. And for us, we're celebrating 25 years of impact, and a new word I can now use, resilience. Impact and resilience for City First, as we're celebrating our 25th anniversary with an awards reception. So go City First. We're going to applaud ourselves and all of you who really did the heavy lifting. And the way we're going to celebrate is not really, you know, talking about us. It's going to be talking about the folks who have really done the just amazing work in this city and have been resilient. So you're going to see a lineup of community development professionals who have really made change in this city and practitioners. And in that, what we're really doing is we're reflecting on our 25 years of community investment, and we're in turn honoring those visionary institutions and mission-driven mavericks. I like that term. So we're going to be celebrating through a variety of awards. So it's going to be kind of like the Emmys or the Oscars or something, I don't know, where we have different categories. We're going to have the Chairman's Award, the Resilience, new best word, Resilience Awards, and then one that's particularly important and longstanding for City First, the Baptist Legacy Awards, and we're going to do all that within an hour. So these powerful partners that we're going to be sharing have really been true leaders and pioneers. They have helped create accessible health care, access to quality education. I was just talking with a gentleman about how important that is, affordable housing, arts engagement, and small business employment, small business, I'm going to say development and employment for all, and that's really set a foundation for urban resilience, the topic we had today. So let's go ahead and there he is. Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with awards, but before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce someone who I think most of us in economic and community development who are awake in the city certainly know, and that is our Deputy Mayor of Planning and Economic Development, and that's Mr. Brian Kinner. And I have this incredible bio that he does not want me to read and embarrass him. And so therefore I will at least share a little bit of it, because I think it's important that you have a little sense of him and his commitment to our city. He was appointed by Mayor Bowser in January 2015. And of course, as I mentioned, he's the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development. And in that role, really, he's primarily focused on producing and preserving affordable housing. Hey, weren't we just talking about that? Creating employment opportunities for district residents and increasing the district's tax revenue. His active real estate portfolio, which I think just got bigger, is $7 billion. Did it get bigger? Yeah, a little bit. He's playing with big boy money. Under his leadership, we've seen important development projects like St. E's all the way to Walter Reed that he has been an integral part of. And I think he's also been very importantly focused on the mayor's vision of inclusive prosperity and helped develop the strategy document to really push that forward. He won't talk about any of that, but I want you to know that. And part of that strategy had important funding for women entrepreneurs in a grant program and inclusive innovation funding, again, with at the campus of Howard, with an incubator at the campus of Howard University. All right, so he also manages the Housing Production Trust Fund, so if anybody's in affordable housing, that certainly means something to you, and I will tell you it is one of the more impressive city production trust funds throughout this nation. And I got to say this because I read this and I didn't realize that you're actually managing 20 government agencies. So all the discussions that we were talking about of how we need to involve the government, he's going to probably try and run out quickly afterwards, but if he doesn't, he's the man. He's the guy you need to talk to. He went to University of Iowa. I think that's interesting. But he also went to the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and has been named one of the 100 most influential business people in Washington, D.C. by the Washington Business Journal. It's my great pleasure to bring Brian Kenner to the stage.
Thank you. That was quite embarrassing, and so we'll just keep it moving on to that. But I do want to thank Brian and the entire City First team for obviously bringing people together. Another round of applause for Brian and the rest of the City First team for having me here today. Obviously, I am Brian Kenner, the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development, and on behalf of Mayor Bowser, I'm very happy to be here for your award celebration, really celebrating 25 years of City First. My personal story with City First is that when I first came to Washington, D.C., and that was in 1997 or so, I was working for what was then a very small charter school. I was on the board of a charter school, Cesar Chavez Charter School, in its original location in the Waterside Mall. It was actually in the basement of the Waterside Mall, and it was, I think, taking over an old, it looked like a dry cleaning space. I actually don't know what kind of space the school was located in, and they needed a financial partner. And who was the organization that stepped up to be the financial partner but City First Bank? And that was when City First Bank was, I think, located off of 14th Street, one of their original locations, at a time when I remember when we went up there to do our first deposits, because part of my job as board member was to literally take the money over to City First Bank. There was, it's the 90s, okay? Do people remember the 90s? It's the 90s. So you had to physically take the money over there a little bit. There was nothing but parking lots, like around where they were located at. And I think it was like a strip mall that they were located at. And, you know, many people around here remember those times. And I think that not only is it a testament to City First Bank, that not only are they still providing access to important investments and resources for many organizations in the city, but frankly that they're still here. They have, I think, prospered the way that the city has prospered since that time. We have had, you know, I think many different things happen in Washington, D.C., and I'm so very happy to have City First continue to be a thriving part of what we do here in the city. Your theme, resilience, is obviously very key to the work that I do as a part of the Bowser administration. You know, part of our responsibilities are to ensure growth and prosperity across all 8 wards. We also have to make sure that we maintain a thriving economy. The mayor likes to say, I got 3 jobs, right? People have heard me say this before. And if I do those jobs well, I get to keep my job. I like my job. So I try to do these jobs as much as possible. I've got to be focused on affordable housing in the District of Columbia. I've got to be focused on getting DC residents jobs, and I've got to be focused on increasing tax revenue, which helps to pay for the important investments that we make in the city. And so having partners like City First around makes that much easier for us to continue to have a thriving economy, and frankly, for me to have my 3 jobs. So I appreciate that, Brian, very much. On behalf of Mayor Bowser, then, I'm very honored to be here, and because I'm the deputy mayor, I get to read proclamations, which is kind of a cool thing. I don't get to write them, but I get to read them. And so I'm going to read a proclamation from the mayor, which says, December 7th, 2018. Whereas, for 25 years, City First has been focused on providing access to capital and resources to individuals, nonprofit organizations, and small businesses to help them strengthen our communities. Whereas, to date, City First has directed over $1.3 billion in mission-focused capital intent on having positive and transformational community impact through mission-critical loans and new market tax credit allocations. Whereas, City First has supported the creation and retention of almost 8,000 units of affordable housing and over 15,000 charter school seats. Whereas, City First has served approximately 785,000 clients through its investments in nonprofit social service providers who have built iconic educational, health, and arts facilities. Whereas, investments in small businesses in underserved communities across the Washington region have created or preserved over 18,300 jobs. Whereas, in 1999, City First became Washington, D.C.'s first certified community development financial institution, BAKE, founded to help close socioeconomic gaps experienced by the district's most vulnerable populations. Whereas, in 2017, City First also became the first certified B corporation based in Washington, D.C., having demonstrated an indelible commitment to delivering significant social impact to society through its mission, using business as a force for good. Now, therefore, I'm deputy mayor, but it says mayor, obviously. I, Mayor of Washington, D.C., do hereby proclaim December 7th, 2018 as City First Day in Washington, D.C., signed Mayor Muriel Bowser.
We're going to do a little photo op over here. Make sure I don't lose this, right? A lot of whereases, but I'm humbled on another front as well, and that's in my position as the CEO of the bank. I get to meet a lot of people who tell me that they were there at the beginning, or they were served by what we did early on, and it's amazing. I've met a lot of people who have been part of this grassroots effort that became City First. So we really are entirely from the community, and our directive is to continue to be about the community and for the community. So thank you. Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. Great name, right? Brian? Also spelled with an I. Okay, so next we're going to bring up our Chair-elect, the Honorable Marie Johns, for the next portion of our ceremony. Thank you, Marie.
Hey, Chuck. Good evening, Chuck. Chuck, how are you? So good to see you.
Hi, Chuck.
All right, so Muck and Foos, I call them
I call Chuck Muckenfoos. Muckenfoos. Anyway, let me start over.
Chuck, as we gather here today to celebrate City First 25 years, it's only appropriate that we also need to recognize all of your tenure.
Muckenfoos is very proud to have been one of the founders of City First. He really loved the fact that he was able to build an organization that helped the city and that enriched so many people's lives.
You know, it's funny, when you first meet Chuck, he comes across very much as a lawyer, as a former regulator, as someone who's very well respected in his field, someone who is very much by-the-book guy.
If someone were to ask me, how would I describe Chuck's relationship to the bank? I would say that Chuck is the bank's BFF. Always loyal, always challenging, always present, always there.
I want to thank you for your clear guidance and counsel. Multiple scenarios, but always a good suggestion as to what we really should be doing, thinking from both our intellect and also our heart.
So my grandfather, Lloyd D. Smith, founding chairman of City First, had to do what he had to do to impact social and economic development in a way that was prolific and respected by most, if not all. So thanks for carrying the torch, Chuck, and preserving his legacy.
One of the things I think he probably loved the most, though, was working with the people at City First for these past 25 years. Debbie, Lloyd, and of course Brian, that brought him so much joy.
But the thing I've come to appreciate about you, Chuck, over the years is that what drives you is not rules and restrictions and limitations, but it's all about commitment to the cause and about the possibilities.
I also want to thank you as a friend. It's been a lot of fun getting to know you and serving alongside you. And you're a great guy, Chuck. Really appreciate it.
Chuck, congratulations. Good luck in the next step in your life with the retirement from the bank. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck.
Congratulations, honey. We love you.
I wish you well there. You did a great job. I think you were singularly responsible for the bank happening, and it wouldn't have happened without you and your dedication over the last 25 years.
I wish you well in the future. Keep up the good work.
Chuck, you know, what else can I say? I love you. You done good.
Did we surprise you? Did we surprise you? That was the whole point. So I just have a couple of things to say before I get out of the way, and the man of the hour has a moment to speak. So I'm overdressed for the occasion because I'm supposed to be at a holiday party with my husband right now. But I told him, well, you have to wait, honey, because I have something really important to do first this evening, and that is to give honor to Chuck Muckenfoos. And I will be brief because these shoes I'm wearing have about 52 minutes and 37 seconds left. So I will be moving on soon. The women in the audience, Sonia, so do you understand? All right. So I didn't know Muckenfoos first. I was blessed to know the great Lloyd Smith and Debbie Baptist, and I worked for the phenomenal Delano Lewis, if any of you in the room remember that name. He's the one who connected me with Lloyd and with Debbie, and then CNP Telephone Company was there at the beginning of the bank. I met Chuck through his wonderful wife, Angela. Angela and I are both Girl Scouts, and when I was co-chairing a capital campaign for the Girl Scouts with Barbara Krumzik, I worked with Angela, and through that was able to meet Chuck. I'm not ashamed to tell you that I take on the role of chair of this great institution with a measure of trepidation. I'm not a banker. But Chuck has promised to take my phone calls and to meet me at TED's every now and then to give me some coaching. So Chuck, we hope we surprised you with that video, and we hope that it's in some way gives a measure of our love and affection for you and our gratitude for all that you've done for this institution. Thank you.
Well, I'm almost speechless. So I guess the first thing I should say is kind of back at you. And frankly, it is an honor for me to have my successor be Marie Johns, and who is extraordinarily able and distinguished. I would be, they've already been mentioned, but I think I'd like for us to, I want to mention three people that aren't here. One is John Hamilton, the mayor of Bloomington, Indiana, who is, in whose mind the idea that if Bill Clinton's presidency was going to have 100 new community development banks, which we promised, that Washington ought to have one. And so we wouldn't be having this conversation without John. And then secondly, it's hard to say it without crying. I would remember Debbie and Lloyd. I counted on their being here now, and I still miss them. I want to also just mention three people, other people who were here at the beginning. Dessa Seeley, right here. Peggy Hamilton, who was our pro bono lawyer at Wilmer Cutler, and who you met on screen, and who was our first general counsel, and Mike Helfer, who is my good and dear friend, who was Peggy's boss and was the first pro bono lawyer at Wilmer Cutler for the bank. I'm going to do something that my friends would advise me not to do, which is to say, but there's a message here, both about why I'm here and also a larger message. And what I'm always advised not to do is don't dwell in ancient history and don't be narcissistic. But I'm going to do both, and hopefully make an important point. And I want to come back to something that George, if I can quote him properly, said earlier. I grew up in Montgomery, Alabama. I was born in 1945. Therefore, I remember the buses going by in 1955 and 56 without any black folks. My church was 5 blocks from Dr. King's church. My pastor, who I loved and who did wonderful things for my parents and me, was fired in 1956. Now, why would a white pastor be fired in Montgomery, Alabama in 1956? Well, it was because he was a little sympathetic to the boycott and to the notion of integration. I was, in 1963, from here to that sign over there behind George Wallace, when he gave his segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever speech. At that moment, what went through my mind, an 18-year-old, was, this is wrong, this is stupid, and it will pass. And I want to underscore that last part. Never in my wildest imagination could I have conceived that 55 years later, subject of race, 55 years later, Montgomery legal segregation would be gone, but Montgomery would remain a segregated city, and that I would live in a larger society which was substantially segregated. And even worse, and not only could I possibly imagine that the subject of race would be central to our politics, or that we would have a panel on this stage in which that would be a central conversation. We didn't have any money when I was a kid, and but I was white, and I could not have imagined that over 55 years, the disparities in wealth and income would grow and still be accelerating. So I guess and I don't want to be pessimistic, I think there is a lot to be optimistic about in terms of, if you look around this room, nobody in this room doesn't know and understand what it was that I said. We do have institutions like City First, which has been a collaboration, and I think roughly an equal collaboration of white and black. And we have achieved a lot. The deputy mayor outlined the kinds of impact that City First has had, and I am proud of that. But I think what I do want to underscore, and here's where I come back to what George had to say earlier, we need to be candid about what needs to be done. That is to say, we really need to talk about it and say it, and not be scared about saying it. And the thing that makes you scared about saying it is that the challenges, if anything, are larger, more complex, and more daunting, in part because we've wasted 55 years. And so my point, and I guess what I would close on is, and I think the people in this room are capable of doing it, but what I would close on is that in order not to be having this same conversation, if we don't do it now, 55 years from now, we may not be here. But when you think about climate, but if we don't do it, if we're not willing to think about radical solutions and be willing to talk about the scale of not the problems, but the investments that need to be made to meet those challenges. Now, I think we can do it, and when you look at the people in the room and listen to the people that were on the panel, and you look at what City First has done and the tools that are available, I am optimistic. Thank you very much.
Here. So I let you clap your speech on your breakfast.
Yes.
Right to the ward.
Okay.
I'll bring it. Yeah. No, that's okay. You're next. You get the doing a photo here. Why don't y'all step over there a little bit and give him the award. You need to get in front of. Yeah, get over there if you don't mind. All right. Thank you, Marie. Yes. No, the two of you. Yes, that'll be great. The two of you can do it together. Thank you. You want to bring the other three?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's see, Ellen, Hassan,
Kathy.
and Kathy.
Kathy's over here. While they come to the stage, I want all of the City First directors, past and present, if you can raise your hands so people can acknowledge you and we can thank you and people can see you. Thank you. It's an amazing group. as they take photos, what are we doing? This is Dr. Miner, Dr. Hassan Miner, Kathy McKinless, and Ellen Lazar, who are also rolling off the board this year, and we wanted to both thank them for their unbelievable service and incredible impact to this organization and thus to our city in this way. And so thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Dr. Miner. I won't say Hassan here, but thank you, Dr. Miner. Thank you, Kathy, tremendously. You've done an incredible job in leading.
Good evening. That was impressive. I am so happy to be here. I'm Lisa Mensa of Opportunity Finance Network. There's a proverb in the Ghanaian tradition of Sankofa. It means it's a bird arching back. It means you have to look back at your history in order to get forward. And that tribute was powerful. Thank you for reminding us of our history and allowing us to go forward. I'm here to do the transition to the City First 25th Anniversary Resilience Award. Now we're going to look at the future and celebrate some of the collective work and impact of community-focused investments in small businesses and in nonprofits who've worked to strengthen our city of Washington, D.C. Why am I up here? I lead Opportunity Finance Network, which is the national association of all of the country's community development financial institutions. These institutions are lenders and investors. We lend and invest in homes, in businesses, and in facilities. There's over 250 of them who are members of OFN, and we like to think that it is institutions like City First who help money flow to people and places where traditional finance doesn't reach. So it is exciting to be celebrating the 25th anniversary of City First. We're so proud of the work that City First does. In case you didn't know, it wasn't even in the mayor's thing, they've deployed over $1.2 billion in the last 25 years. And it's that kind of lending that keeps the city vibrant and helps to tackle unemployment and poverty, especially in places like Wards 7 and 8. We also want to tip our hat to City First as a thought leader. You saw that here if you were part of the conversation. When City First was first certified, there were less than 20 community development financial institutions banked. And now there are 135 CDFI banks. And City First was one of the founding organizations that started the Community Development Bankers Association, or CDVA, and I see Janine Jacobs and Carla Manning's here, an important voice for this positive change, for the notion that banks can have a double and triple bottom line. It is powerful. So tonight, we're taking a moment to applaud the spirit of resilience that City First and their partners demonstrate. And through these next awardees, we're going to see what's possible with grit and determination and can-do. Yes, it takes the finance, but it also takes great partners. We talked a minute ago about gentrification, and we see that as the DC area gentrifies, City First and its partners continue to preserve and strengthen the communities around the city, especially east of the river. Because of City First and their partners, people can build lives for themselves. That means affordable homes, small businesses, and important community facilities. So I want to just say I am so thankful, Brian, that you invited me to be here. Thank you for this board. I applaud the vision of change of the groups that we're awarding today. This is the reason we have a bank. And the awardees tonight work in communities that need their resilience. So to all of the resilience awardees, congratulations for being a part of what it takes to help communities and individuals overcome and make us all stronger. Thank you, and bravo.
So thank you, Lisa. It's great to be sharing the podium with you. I'm Phyllis Caldwell. I'm a board member of City First, and I chair the Business and Community Development Committee. And one of the things that is important to the bank, as you've heard, is our customers. So I get the privilege of inviting each of our Resilience Award recipients to the stage to take a photo. I did have some remarks about each one, but in the interest of time, I will just invite them to the stage. But I would encourage you to pick up the program and just read really about what they do and the contributions that they make toward our city, and know that your deposits, your investments, and your contributions to City First go to fuel the customers and businesses and nonprofits that make our city a more resilient place. So let me first call to the stage in the category of health, Bread for the City, and the award recipient is George Jones, who needs no introduction from our earlier panel. Brian, are you in the photo?
No, we're going to do one. Oh, I don't know.
Oh, you should be in the photo. I mean.
Yeah, okay. I thought we were going to do one long photo.
Oh,
okay. Of everyone. Let's do one of everyone.
One long photo.
Yeah, one long.
All right. Okay. Then next up in the category of education, Thurgood Marshall Public Charter School, Richard Pullman. And next in the category of housing, Jubilee Housing, Jim Knight. And I'll just say, for those who want to come up, it's a much easier step to my left. And in the category of arts, Sitar Arts Center, Maureen Dwyer. And in the category of small business, Ben's Chili Bowl, Kamal Ali. And in the category of impact depositor, impact assets, Gabe DeClerico. All right, thank you to our first inaugural Resilience Award recipients. Brian?
All right, let's go in the photo here, and thank you.
Thank you, and now I'll invite to the stage former City First board member and my good friend, Dessa Seeley. Where are you, Dessa? Oh, here she comes.
Good evening. Really lovely to be here and to see City First at 25. I'm a founding board member and former chair of this institution, so I feel like it's my child. I have the distinct pleasure of presenting the Debbie Hurd Baptist Legacy Award to Joe Horning. And Debbie was a force of nature. This bank would not be here but for her. She was both a founding director, and then we drafted her to be CEO, and she was awesome. And with that, I get to bring Joe on board, which is just amazing. Joe, I've known for decades, and I drafted him onto the board, which is one of the better decisions I ever made. He was doing affordable housing before it had a name. He was developing all over the city. He was developing east of 16th Street when no one was doing that. He was developing on 14th Street, and he did what no developer private or for nonprofit would ever do. And he joined a group called the Nehemiah Group with 9 nonprofits and 1 for-profit, and his was the for-profit. We developed a little strip center called the Nehemiah Retail Center. It's a 20,000 square foot center. It was the first retail development on 14th Street in 40 years since the riots. And DC was an extraordinarily different place. There were 10 acres of vacant land up and down 14th Street. We turned a community garden into a neighborhood retail center. So I'm extraordinarily proud to be able to honor him. I'll just add that Joe is one of the most generous people I've ever met. Part of his legacy is the investment that he's done with nonprofits across the city, notably with Martha's Table, where he is doing significant work in Southeast. I can tell a story on him because he's not here, but Joe taught Chris Smith how to be bold in his community giving work. And there was a time when there was a little middle school for girls that Joe was very attached to, and he got Chris to move it. They lost their lease. He got Chris to move it into an apartment building in Southeast, and then they became a real staple in the Arc, which Chris later built. So I want to thank Joe for all that he's done for the city and for me personally, and I am very happy to give him the Debbie Hurd Baptist Legacy Award.
Joe, it's really hard to be brief about your generosity and the gifts that you and your family have given to us at Martha's Table, but it's because of you, Lynn, and your family that we're so happy to be in our beautiful new headquarters in Southeast DC, working with the Horning family and working with our neighbors in our neighborhood where 44% of our neighbors are living below the federal poverty line, and only 1/4 of children are developmentally ready for kindergarten. Martha's Table is working to increase food access, quality education, and family supports, and we do that every day with partners like the Hornings and like Community of Hope. So from all of us at Martha's Table, thank you, thank you, thank you. We wouldn't be here without you.
And I would just want to add, having met Joe 7 or 8 years ago, was really struck by Joe and Lynn and the family's real strong vision for the Commons and his fierce determination to make it happen. So for those of you who were around earlier today, as we talked sort of conceptually about resilience and equity, Joe's a let's get it done kind of guy. And I really feel like the work at the Commons really is us living out the words that we were talking about today. We've been working with Urban Institute to pull data together. We are talking about targeting resources and appropriate services. So Community of Hope is also providing services to prevent homelessness in an area that has one of the highest number of families presenting as homeless. We're also doing home visiting for new parents and their children, as well as really expanding an emotional wellness. And that the Horning Family Fund has really been looking at this work through the equity lens. I just do want to mention that the Horning Family Fund offices are located at the Commons, and I think is one of the only, if not the only, foundation that has their headquarters east of the river, and has been wonderful to partner. So thank you for your generosity of yourself, of your family, and of your love for the community that you're sharing with all of us.
Good evening. It's a joy to be here and share with people of like mind who are committed to the well-being of our city in all its parts, with all of the millenniums and the excitement of the cities emerging from the riots and the growth in population. There's still many, many people on the underside. And many of those, probably most of them, are east of the river. And it's not a coincidence, but that's where I started my business back in 60 years this year, or next year, 1958. So we're coming up. And I was just a naive young fellow, but I found that you could buy lots from the city because people didn't pay their land lots, and you pay a few dollars and you'd own the lot. And so I started a little building that backed into the B&O Railroad. And so people say, what are you doing that for? I said, I didn't pay anything for the land. And with that, we were able to take that and evolve it into other sites. And so we built in Anacostia for 8 years until the riots came. And it was during that period that Jim Banks, who had grown up over there, had worked for Walter Washington, our first mayor, and he told me about this land that his family was given back in the 1920s as a token to colored people. And that's how he got the land. And so it no longer owned it, the city. And so I was able to buy it through his insights. And from that, today is where we've now moved the headquarters for Martha's Table. And they have set up, as you just heard, a very aggressive and substantive program for mothers and children and families. And it's a wonderful testament to Martha's Table, and we're grateful to have been a partner in that effort. And as I say, it's just what I've been able to do in a humble way, but one that I'm proud of, is to combine social commitment with the business and hopefully be successful in both. So I just thanks this for this recognition, and I look forward to keeping you posted. We're going to build 120 affordable apartments that'll be middle income under the programs that the mayor's as people have put together. And then we're going to have for sale housing of 40 units. So there is an awareness of building some balance, because there certainly are many affordable housing units. So it's not we're going to build high end, but middle income is what this will be. But it's all part of the focus of, and back to the bank, what they have been able to do is have a social mission and be successful economically. And that, to me, is the testament of how social programs can be effective in a way that goes beyond just being a nonprofit. Not that they're not appropriate, but I think the City First has been able to take that combination and make it successful. So to City First, we like to raise a toast.
Let's go over here. We'll go over here with Dustin. Thank you. Thank you. And then you all can turn, and as they take that wonderful photo opportunity, here we go. All right. Well, I want to congratulate all of our awardees. Thank you all. Thank you, Joe. Congratulate all of our awardees this evening. I also want to thank all of our speakers and panelists and data presenters. I guess some of those are the same, but and mostly all of you for really being here and charging this day and making it significant and important for our city. It's funny because it's impossible to cover urban resilience in a city, or even to cover 25 years of history in a short afternoon. But I think it's important that we cram it in there and get that dialogue started and get that recognition where it is due. This will formally conclude our 25th anniversary reception. I really, really do thank you for coming and appreciate it. What we're going to do now, as we're concluding, is we're going to need to actually change over the room. So I'd ask you to Don't got to go home. But anyway, we're going to change over the room. So we ask you to go ahead and do that last bit of mingling. In particular, this side of the room, we're going to have to clear. And thank you very much, and glad you were here. Staff, City First staff. Oh, wait, one more thing. Whoa. Let me get your attention. Over at the bar, no music yet. I really want to make sure, hold on, I want everybody to hear this. This is really important. Putting together an event like this is no small undertaking, and I want to make sure I acknowledge the City First staff and volunteers who really helped us to put this together to deliver to you. So I'll mention a few, but there are many. I certainly want to mention Gloria Naughton, Cynthia Newell, Eugene Kim, Catherine Harper, Lisa Williams, and there were many more. I'd like to thank our participants. Halcyon, thank you as well, our partners and sponsors. So again, thanks and enjoy. Bye. Hey, man.